What if I told you that the person listening to this right now isn't actually the only you inside your head?
Right, which sounds completely crazy at first.
It really does. But what if there's this like biological, measurable backup version of yourself, a completely different configuration of your identity that just quietly takes the wheel when your environment gets too stressful or, too hostile for the primary you to handle?
I mean, it completely shatters this entire illusion we walk around with every day because we all possess this deep-seated assumption that human identity is like a poured concrete foundation.
Right. You build the house, the walls go up, the layout is fixed.
Exactly. And when you walk through the front door, you expect it to be exactly the same house every single time.
Hmm.
But the neurobiology actually tells a completely different story.
Yeah, because the reality is the moment you walk into a highly antagonistic corporate boardroom or endure some kind of severe trauma or even just find yourself in a screaming match with a family member, that solid concrete house instantly turns into like a labyrinth of hidden rooms and trapdoors.
It really does. Who you fundamentally are is highly fluid. And honestly, we are just barely starting to understand the machinery behind it.
The landscape of human identity is just incredibly plastic. We're looking at a deeply evolved survival system here.
One that actively reshapes our perception of self, depending on exactly what the environment demands in that moment.
Which is exactly what we are unpacking today. So welcome to Today in the Hypothesis. We are exploring a premise that sounds like it was pulled straight out of a comic book.
But it's actually sitting at the very bleeding edge of cognitive psychology and evolutionary biology.
Exactly. Our mission today is to figure out if the idea that every single human being natively develops an alter ego for self-preservation is an actual measurable biological fact or just a, really compelling cultural myth.
And to do this justice, we are pulling from a massive, incredibly dense research synthesis. We're looking at a paper by independent researcher Victor H. Sertouche, which was synthesized and prepared by Gemini.
Oh, right. The one titled Epistemological, Neurobiological, and Sociocultural Evaluation of the Alter Ego Hypothesis.
That's the one. And it forces us to completely redefine what an alter ego actually is. We are going to look at this through the lenses of hard neurobiology, microsociology, and even the historical context of marginalized communities.
Okay, let's unpack this because I know there are listeners right now thinking, I definitely don't have an alter ego. I am just consistently me all the time.
Which is a very normal reaction.
Right. But hold that thought. By the end of this exploration, you might realize you deployed a highly specialized secondary persona this very morning.
Absolutely.
Maybe when you had to answer a completely unhinged work email, or when you drop your kids off at school, and you probably did it so flawlessly you didn't even notice.
So we should probably start by defining our terms. Because when we hear the phrase alter ego, the brain immediately goes to classical psychiatry.
Right, we think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, two entirely distinct people fighting for control over one physical body.
Yeah, and in the classical psychiatric literature, that is the literal translation. Alter ego comes from Latin, meaning second self.
Right.
In that strict clinical formulation, it implies a completely compartmentalized, discrete persona operating right alongside your primary personality. You'd have entirely separate autobiographical memories, autonomous motor controls, and even unique physiological baseline states.
Wait, so if that is the strict criteria we are judging the hypothesis against, the idea that every single human on Earth is walking around with a fully developed autonomous second personality waiting in the wings, then the hypothesis is just false, right?
Definitively false in that literal sense, yes. We aren't all experiencing literal Jekyll and Hyde fragmentation.
Right. Okay.
However, the paper immediately pivots and challenges the opposite extreme. If we don't have two completely separate selves, the assumption is that we must have one singular unified self.
Which Sertouche's research calls the monolithic self myth.
Exactly. And modern neuroimaging has thoroughly dismantled this idea. There is no central, self gland in the brain. Identity isn't housed in a single anatomical structure.
So if there's no central control room with a single me sitting at the desk, what actually are we? The phrasing in the research that really stood out to me was that human identity is a dynamic amalgam of neural self-states.
I love that description.
Yeah, it implies that we are more like a collection of different operating systems, and the brain is just seamlessly booting up whichever system is most appropriate for the current moment.
That's a highly accurate framework, and to understand how those operating systems transition, we really have to look at the default mode network, or the DMN.
Right, the DMN.
The DMN is a widespread distributed network across several regions of the brain, and this is basically the primary engine of your resting, safe state. It governs self-referential thought.
My understanding is that the DMN is essentially the brain's internal storyteller. Like, it's the network that maintains your autobiographical memory, right?
Yes, exactly. It constantly weaves together the narrative of who you are, where you came from, what your values are, what you like. It provides narrative continuity.
It creates the illusion of the monolithic self.
It does. And under non-threatening conditions, your brain's synaptic plasticity allows you to shift smoothly between different healthy states. So, like, you might be highly focused and action-oriented while working, and then become reflective and relaxed while reading a book on the couch.
Okay, I see.
The DMN bridges those shifts so seamlessly that you feel like one continuous entity. But the critical variable here is safety. The DMN can only maintain that cohesive narrative when the organism perceives that it is safe from harm.
Wait, so what happens when the fire alarm goes off? If the storyteller requires safety to function, what does the brain do when I'm suddenly walking down the street and a car swerves onto the sidewalk right at me?
Everything changes.
Or, in a more modern context, my boss suddenly calls me into their office, slams the door, and starts screaming about a massive failure. The narrative continuity has to break down, doesn't it?
It shatters instantly. When the brain detects a severe relational or environmental threat, the fluid integration of the DMN reorganizes with terrifying speed.
Wow.
Narrative continuity is completely abandoned in favor of immediate self-preservation. This is known as the threat detection cascade.
I really want to dig into the anatomy of that threat response because it's not just a general hazy feeling of panic. It is a highly orchestrated biological sequence, isn't it?
It is incredibly precise. The moment that threat is perceived, the deepest, oldest parts of the brain completely take over.
The subcortical structures.
Exactly. The cascade initiates in the amygdala, which acts as your primary neurobiological smoke detector. The amygdala detects the threat and instantly fires a signal to the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, the BNST.
And the BNST is what sustains the anxiety, right? Like, the amygdala is the initial alarm bell, but the BNST is what keeps the siren blaring.
You've got it. It maintains that state of hypervigilance, so you don't just relax the second the immediate danger passes.
Because that would be terrible for survival.
Right. And while the BNST is keeping you vigilant, the periaqueductal gray, the PAG gets activated.
Okay, what does the PAG do?
The PAG is fascinating because it is the structural coordinator for your physical survival responses. It physically prepares the body to run, fight, or freeze. So you have this massive subcortical uprising detection, sustained vigilance, and physical mobilization.
But we aren't just lizards running purely on instinct. While this deep brain alarm system is screaming, the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is desperately trying to keep a lid on things.
Right, very hard, yes.
I think about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, and the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. These are the conscious, rational managers of the brain.
That's right.
They are trying to apply impulse control and context. They're screaming, "Do not punch your boss. You need this job to pay your mortgage."
You're describing the fundamental tension of the human condition right there. It is a constant neurological tug-of-war between the subcortical structure screaming survive and the prefrontal cortex demanding behave. In normal, everyday stressors, the prefrontal cortex can usually modulate that subcortical panic. But in situations of extreme, chronic, or overwhelming threat, that top-down modulation breaks down.
Which brings us to a concept from the paper that completely reframed how I understand trauma, the corticolimbic inhibition model.
It's a game changer.
The research suggests that when the brain's threat processing apparatus is pushed past its absolute limits, it physically branches into one of two very distinct modulatory pathways just to survive.
The brain literally has to make a structural choice on how to handle the overload. The first pathway is emotion under modulation.
Meaning there isn't enough top-down control. The rational brain essentially fails to contain the explosion.
Yes, exactly. In this pathway, you see a marked hypoactivation like an underfunctioning of the medial prefrontal cortex.
So the manager in the front office is either overwhelmed or just completely goes offline.
Right, and simultaneously there is massive hyperactivation of the limbic structures. The emotional centers just run completely unchecked. Clinically, this manifests as classic post-traumatic stress disorder.
Wow. Okay. So we're talking about hyperarousal, emotional flooding, intrusive flashbacks. The smoke detector is basically taped in the on position. The alarm is blaring 204/7, and the part of the brain supposed to turn it off is paralyzed.
That is undermodulation, yes. It's devastating, but it's only one pathway. The second pathway is where the biological roots of the alter ego hypothesis truly lie. This is emotion overmodulation.
Overmodulation. So instead of the prefrontal cortex failing, it becomes a tyrant. It exerts too much control.
It goes into extreme overdrive. You see intense hyperactivation of the medial prefrontal cortex, which ruthlessly clamps down on the limbic reactivity.
Oh, wow.
It suppresses the emotional centers entirely to prevent catastrophic psychological failure. This creates the dissociative subtype of PTSD.
So the clinical presentation here isn't panic or flooding, it's depersonalization and derealization.
Exactly. The individual feels totally detached from their own mind, their own body, or they feel like the world around them is entirely artificial.
I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. Imagine the brain is a massive, complex soundboard at a live concert. In the undermodulation pathway, the trauma is a deafening feedback loop, and the volume slider is just cranked to the absolute maximum, blowing out the main speakers.
I like this analogy.
But in emotion overmodulation, the brain recognizes that the sheer volume of the trauma is going to physically destroy the entire sound system. So in a split second, it completely severs the audio cables to the main speakers and reroutes that screaming feedback to a secondary isolated speaker system locked in a soundproof room in the basement.
That's spot on.
The main stage stays quiet, the show goes on, but the trauma is still blasting in total isolation.
That is a phenomenal way to understand it. The brain actively reroutes the traumatic experience to protect the primary operating system. Now, consider what happens when this overmodulation isn't just a one-time event, but a chronic necessity.
Right.
Specifically, I mean, in cases of severe, inescapable developmental trauma during early childhood.
Because a child cannot fight a predator, and they usually cannot physically flee an abusive home. Their only biological option is to escape inward. They have to freeze and dissociate.
And this is occurring while the child's neurological identity is still actively forming. Because the brain is forced to chronically reroute this trauma into isolated neural networks, the default mode network is never allowed to weave a single cohesive narrative.
The experiences are just too contradictory.
Precisely. The child has to hold the reality of my caregiver is a source of terror, right alongside the biological imperative of I must attach to my caregiver to survive. The monolithic self simply cannot hold that paradox.
So it splinters the identity fragment structurally to compartmentalize the paradox, which results in the most extreme literal manifestation of the alter ego hypothesis dissociative identity disorder, or DIDI.
What used to be colloquially called multiple personality disorder. But DID is the precise clinical term because, as we established earlier, there is no multiple self to begin with.
Right.
It is a single developing personality that structurally fragments into isolated autonomous self-states.
And what's wild is that these fragmented states, these alters, are not imaginary friends or, psychological metaphors. The research outlines how functional neuroimaging has proven that these alters are structurally, biologically real.
The data there is staggering. When neuroscientists put patients with DI into fMRI machines and observe them transitioning between different self-states, they aren't just seeing a change in mood, they are measuring entirely distinct configurations of neural connectivity.
Wait, really? Like entirely different layouts?
Yes. If a patient switches from a hyper-aroused alter that serves as a container for traumatic memory to an emotionally numbed alter whose job is simply to go to work and function, their physiological baselines change.
So it's not just brainwaves. The actual physical body responds differently depending on which neural network is active.
Exactly. Researchers have documented measurable shifts in pain thresholds. An alter that endured physical abuse might have completely different sensitivity to pain than a host alter. You see changes in motor control, visual acuity, and shifts in autonomic tone.
Autonomic tone meaning their resting heart rate and blood pressure literally change depending on which identity is present.
Yes, exactly. What's fascinating here is it fundamentally rewrites our understanding of what the human body is capable of.
The brain can alter its physical operating parameters to isolate unbearable trauma into one localized network, just so that a secondary network can wake up the next morning, eat breakfast, and act like nothing happened. It is the ultimate biological defense mechanism.
It is a profound pathoneurobiological adaptation. Now, it's crucial to state that DID is rare. It occurs in less than 1% of the general population. True, Structurally autonomous clinical alters are the extreme exception, born of extreme circumstances.
But, and this is the absolute crux of the issue in this deep dive into the source material, the biological machinery that makes D-Di possible is not an anomaly. That underlying corticolimbic circuitry, the ability of the brain to modulate identity, suppress emotion, and deploy a specialized self-state to protect the organism, that hardware is installed in every single human being.
That is the pivotal insight of Sertucci's paper. We're not all structurally fragment, obviously, but the functional capacity for identity shifting is a universal biological inheritance. Evolution demanded it.
So if we all have this underlying wiring, how does it manifest in the 99% of people who don't have DD? If we aren't structurally fragmenting to survive unimaginable abuse, why did evolution give us the ability to shift our identities in the first place?
Well, because the physical environment of early hominids was incredibly volatile, we had to be able to instantly shift our behavioral and psychological state to match the immediate survival requirements of the environment.
That makes sense.
To understand the mechanics of this in a modern, everyday context, we have to look at polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges. It is the foundational framework for understanding how our autonomic nervous system navigates safety and danger.
Polyvagal theory essentially maps out the nervous system as an evolutionary hierarchy, right? Like a ladder with 3 distinct rungs, each representing a different era of our evolutionary development.
A ladder is the perfect visual for this. At the very top of the ladder is the newest evolutionary circuit, the ventral vagal system. This is the mammalian social engagement system.
Okay.
When you are operating from this circuit, you feel safe. Your heart rate is regulated, your facial muscles are relaxed and expressive, your middle ear structures actually adjust to better hear higher frequency human voices.
So this is the primary relaxed self. The Bruce Wayne enjoying a gala, totally at ease, open, curious, and capable of deep connection.
Yes. But the moment the environment presents a threat, a loud noise, an aggressive stranger, a predatory animal, you drop down a rung on the ladder to the sympathetic nervous system. This is the classic fight-or-flight mobilization circuit.
And social engagement goes completely out the window here.
Utterly. Your heart rate spikes, blood is shunted away from your digestive organs and pushed into your major muscle groups. Your vision narrows.
Right.
You lose the ability to read subtle facial expressions because nuance just doesn't matter anymore. You are a survival machine geared for immediate aggressive action or rapid escape.
But what happens if fighting or fleeing isn't mathematically possible, if the threat is entirely overwhelming or just inescapable?
Then you plummet to the very bottom of the ladder to the phylogenetically oldest circuit, the dorsal vagal system. This is an ancient reptilian defense mechanism. It governs immobilization, freeze, and feigned death.
Wow.
Your heart rate plummets dramatically, endorphins flood the system to dull pain receptors, and you experience deep emotional numbness and disconnection. It is literally the body preparing for the end.
Now, I don't consciously decide to move up and down this ladder, right? Like if I'm arguing with someone, I don't pause and think, I believe I will now deploy my sympathetic nervous system to yell louder. This is happening entirely beneath our conscious awareness.
It is entirely subconscious, driven by a process called neuroception. Neuroception is your nervous system constantly acting as a radar, just scanning the environment, facial expressions, tones of voice, and spatial relationships for cues of safety or danger. It happens milliseconds before your conscious brain even registers what's going on.
And this is where it ties directly back to our personalities and the alter ego hypothesis. Because if someone grows up in an environment where that neuroception radar is constantly pinging danger, maybe due to poverty, a volatile household, or chronic bullying, the nervous system doesn't just react in the moment and then go back to the top of the ladder. It actually recalibrates its baseline. Right. Exactly. When early adversity repeatedly triggers these survival states, the brain creates enduring, protective personality structures to navigate that specific type of hostility. The paper refers to these structures as ecophenotypes.
Ecophenotypes. I really love this concept because these aren't clinical alters with different names, but they are highly specialized survival facades. They are personality architectures built around the core trauma responses, the 4Fs: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn.
Sertucci maps these out brilliantly. Let's examine how the fight response calcifies into an ecophenotype. The paper calls this the aggressive defender persona. This is an identity organized entirely around proactive aggression, hypervigilance, and an obsessive need for control.
We all know people who operate exactly like this. The coworker who treats a minor scheduling mistake as a personal attack, or the person who dominates every conversation with sheer volume. From the outside, it just looks like they are an aggressive jerk. But structurally, what is actually happening? Structurally, their nervous system is permanently stuck on the sympathetic rung of the ladder. The subconscious logic driving the aggressive defender is basically, if I am always the loudest, the biggest, and the most intimidating presence in the room, no one can ever victimize me.
So the aggression is a preemptive shield.
Exactly. It is a persona deployed to mask a profound underlying terror of vulnerability.
What about the flight response? How does a biological urge to run away turn into a personality structure?
The flight response manifests as the avoidant protector persona. This identity relies on emotional detachment, physical withdrawal, and an extreme, almost rigid form of self-sufficiency. If the aggressive defender pushes outward, the avoidant protector pulls inward.
So this is the person who ghosts relationships the second they get serious, or the colleague who refuses to ask for help even when they are completely drowning in work.
Yes.
The underlying logic is incredibly sad, but it makes total biological sense. If I never need anyone, if I never allow anyone to get close enough to see my core self, I can never be betrayed, abandoned, or hurt. Their alter ego protects them by constantly severing connection.
Precisely. Then we move to the freeze response, which utilizes that deep, ancient dorsal vagal circuitry. This creates the detached survivor ecophenotype. This persona relies heavily on passive freeze mechanisms, profound emotional numbness, and mild depersonalization to endure harm that they perceive as completely unavoidable.
It's a way of enduring pain by essentially vacating the premises, right? If you can't fight and you can't run, you just shut down the sensory input. They might seem apathetic, chronically checked out, or lost in a fantasy world. The body is in the room, but the core identity is retreated into the basement.
Yes. And finally, we have the fawn response, which is perhaps the most socially common but least understood survival mechanism. The fawn response generates the social appeaser persona.
Oh man, the social appeaser. This one resonates so deeply.
It's a highly complex adaptation. This is a submissive, hyper-attuned identity that instantly surrenders personal boundaries, needs, and opinions to appease a potential aggressor.
Right.
The subconscious logic is pure survival calculation. If I am completely compliant, if I anticipate your needs, make you happy, and reflect exactly what you want me to be, you will not attack me.
If you are listening to this right now, and you've ever judged yourself because you suddenly turn into a total social appeaser, the second an authority figure raises their voice, smiling, nodding, agreeing to take on unreasonable demands. Or maybe you become an avoidant protector during a prince argument with your spouse, suddenly feeling icy, logical, and just wanting to leave the house. I want you to reframe that. You are not being fake. You are not being manipulative, and you aren't broken. Your nervous system is simply deploying an ecophenotype. It is executing a biological strategy honed over millions of years to keep you safe from perceived destruction.
That reframe is vital. These ecophenotypes are deeply adaptive. They are the neurobiology doing exactly what it was designed to do, modulating your identity to ensure the survival of the organism.
Okay, so we've established the deep biological machinery. We know our bodies shift our physiological identities to survive physical threats and chronic trauma, but let's bring this into the realm of modern, everyday life.
Right, away from the extremes.
Exactly. Most of us aren't constantly running from predators. We are dealing with mundane, acute stress. Taking the bar exam, standing up to give a public speech, or staring down a terrifying spreadsheet. Does the brain still use this identity-shifting machinery for mundane stress?
It absolutely does, but it utilizes it through a more cognitive, accessible mechanism. This brings us to the realm of cognitive psychology, where we see that non-clinical populations, everyday people without severe trauma, routinely generate temporary, exemplar-based alter personas to preserve their executive functioning under stress.
This is one of my favorite parts of the research, the Batman effect.
It's brilliant.
This is based on studies led by psychologists Ethan Kross, Özlem Duke, Rachel White, and Stephanie Carlson. And it focuses on how we get through agonizing, frustrating tasks without completely losing our minds.
The initial experiments were conducted with children. The researchers designed tasks specifically engineered to induce intense executive fatigue and frustration. Imagine giving a young child a highly tedious, repetitive sorting task, or asking them to open a puzzle box that is secretly locked.
Oh, that's almost mean.
Right. They're told they can stop whenever they want, but are gently encouraged to keep trying. Naturally, the children get frustrated, their focus shatters, and they want to quit.
But the researchers introduced a fascinating variable here. They instructed a subset of these children to pretend to be an exemplar character, a highly competent persona that the child admired. Batman, Dora the Explorer, Bob the Builder. They even gave them physical props, like a cape, to solidify the persona.
Which is key.
And they were told, when you feel frustrated, don't ask yourself how you feel. Ask yourself, is Batman working hard?
The results were definitive. Adopting that exemplar character drastically improved perseverance, self-regulation, and executive control. The children who adopted the alter ego worked significantly longer, managed their emotional frustration much better, and maintained cognitive focus far better than the children who used their normal first-person perspective.
That is wild.
And crucially, this exact same mechanism holds true in adult populations when they use adult exemplars or third-person self-talk during high-stakes tasks.
So it acts as psychological armor. But how does it actually work? I mean, if I put on an imaginary Batman cape to do my taxes, I know I'm not a billionaire vigilante. I haven't forgotten who I am. So what is the cognitive mechanism that makes this so effective?
The mechanism is driven by a radical shift in how your brain processes internal dialogue, a concept known as psychological self-distancing.
Okay, self-distancing.
When we face acute stress, our default neurobiological setting is egocentric first-person reflection. We immediately think, why am I so stressed? I am failing at this. I can't handle this.
Right, we fuse completely with the emotion.
And that fusion is incredibly costly. That narrow first-person focus actively amplifies emotional distress. It creates an emotional feedback loop that rapidly depletes your executive reserves, the actual metabolic energy your prefrontal cortex relies on to stay focused and solve problems.
So we basically burn up all our cognitive fuel just trying to manage the panic of feeling incompetent.
Exactly. But when you utilize distanced self-talk, referring to yourself in a third person, using your own name, or silently adopting an exemplar alter persona like Batman, you force the brain to step outside that egocentric viewpoint. You fundamentally alter the neural pathway of the emotional threat.
The neurophysiology of this is what truly blew my mind in the notes. This isn't just a mental trick where you try to, think positive. It causes a measurable electrophysiological change in the brain.
The speed of it is what's truly remarkable. Neurophysiological investigations demonstrate that using third-person self-talk, or an alter ego, immediately attenuates, it significantly reduces the late positive potential, or LPP.
Let's unpack the LPP for a second. If I'm looking at an EEG readout of a brain, what exactly is the late positive potential?
The LPP is a very well-documented electrophysiological marker. It is a literal burst of neural electrical activity that spikes when a person is exposed to emotionally intense or threatening stimuli. It is the brain's electrical signature of emotional arousal and threat processing.
I see.
What Cross and his team found is that when you adopt a distanced persona, you suppress that massive LPP spike within 1 second of threat exposure.
Within 1 second. Before your conscious mind even has time to realize that you are calming down, the electrical storm in your brain has already been neutralized.
Yes. And concurrent with that suppression of the LPP, functional magnetic resonance imaging showed a marked decrease in the activation of the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, which is the region heavily involved in self-referential emotional processing.
But wait, this raises a really important question about energy consumption. Usually, if I'm terrified before public speech and I'm trying to force myself to calm down using cognitive reappraisal, telling myself, it's fine, they're just people, don't panic, it is exhausting. Regulating emotion usually takes a massive amount of cognitive effort. Doesn't adopting an alter ego burn just as much energy?
This raises an important question, and it's actually the most elegant part of the entire mechanism. Crucially, this rapid emotional modulation occurs without engaging additional cognitive control networks.
Wait, really? Without extra effort?
Yes. Standard emotion regulation, white-knuckling your way through fear, requires heavy lifting from your executive control centers. It burns massive amounts of glucose. But self-distancing is an inherently efficient, low-effort strategy. By simply shifting the pronoun or the persona, you bypass the emotional short circuit entirely. You don't have to fight the fear, you just step out of its path.
The analogy that comes to mind is stepping out of a hurricane and watching it through a thick pane of soundproof glass. The paper refers to this as separating the experiencing self from the observing self, like that thinking man visual.
Yes. The experiencing self is the biological organism feeling the terror, the frustration, the urge to quit. By adopting the exemplar alter ego, you create a psychological buffer. You empower the observing self to step back and evaluate the situation without being flooded by the experiencing self's panic.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is the true power of the alter ego in daily life. By becoming Batman or whatever professional exemplar you mentally adopt when you walk into a hostile meeting, that temporary persona acts as a shock absorber. It takes the hit.
Exactly.
If the meeting goes terribly or the task is impossibly hard, the persona is struggling. Your core vulnerable identity is shielded from the feelings of catastrophic incompetence and fear. And because your core identity isn't flooded with panic, your executive function remains completely intact, allowing you to actually solve the problem.
It is self-preservation in its purest, most efficient cognitive form. You are actively modulating your identity parameters to protect your mind's operational capacity.
It's an incredible internal tool, but what happens when we zoom out? We've established how we use these masks internally, inside our own heads, to get through tough tasks. But humans are profoundly social creatures.
Mm.
How do we use alter egos externally in the physical world to navigate society? We are transitioning from the internal machinery of the brain into microsociology.
And this transition reveals that the deployment of protective personas is not just an internal psychological trick. It is an absolute structural necessity for navigating human social hierarchies and modern economic systems. To understand this, Sartouche relies heavily on the foundational work of sociologist Erving Goffman, specifically his theory of dramaturgical analysis.
Dramaturgy, the concept that all the world truly is a stage and we are merely players.
In the 1950s, Goffman posited that human social interaction is fundamentally structured as a theatrical performance. We are all actors, continuously engaged in impression management to secure social inclusion, gain resources, and avoid penalties.
Okay, so how did he break that down?
Goffman divided our social environments into two rigidly distinct domains.
Let's lay out the stage. What is the first domain?
The first domain is the front stage. This is the public arena. When you are on the front stage, you are projecting a highly curated, idealized persona. This alter ego is designed to align perfectly with explicit social norms, institutional expectations, and professional standards. You are entirely in character.
So the front stage is the version of me that smiles warmly at the barista even when I'm exhausted, the version that uses flawless grammar in corporate emails, and the version that listens intently to a colleague's incredibly boring story about their weekend, even if I have a migraine and my dog just died. It is a highly managed projection.
Precisely. That is your front stage alter ego. The second domain is the backstage. This is the private domain, explicitly hidden from the public audience. This is where the performance ceases. You drop the mask, you release the suppressed emotions, you decompress, and you step completely out of character.
The backstage is that exact moment you get into your car after a grueling 10-hour shift, slam the door shut, and just let out that massive guttural sigh or yell at the steering wheel. That is the backstage self re-emerging.
Yes. And from a dramaturgical perspective, that polished front stage persona functions as an incredibly powerful, adaptive social alter ego, because the cost of breaking character on the front stage is unimaginably high.
The paper is extremely stark about this reality. It frames the front stage mask not as deception, but as economic self-preservation. If you drop your act in the wrong environment, society imposes devastating penalties.
Yeah, you really do.
We aren't just talking about getting a weird look from a stranger. We are talking about severe social rejection, loss of employment, institutional stigma, and total financial ruin. If a retail worker drops the mask and honestly tells a screaming, abusive customer exactly what they think of them, they lose their livelihood. They can't pay their rent.
Exactly. Constructing and maintaining a compliant, normative, front-stage self is a vital biological survival mechanism translated into an economic context. To deepen this, we have to look at the work of sociologist Arlie Hochschild, who expanded on Goffman's framework by introducing the concept of emotional labor.
We hear the term emotional labor thrown around a lot in pop culture, usually referring to dealing with a difficult friend. But structurally, what did Hochschild mean by it?
Structurally, Hochschild demonstrated how modern service and corporate economies literally commodify human emotion. They require workers to artificially induce or suppress emotional states to align with corporate directives as a strict condition of employment.
I see. So it's literally part of the job description.
Yes, exactly. The classic example is flight attendants. They must perform unrelenting cheerfulness, subservience, and calm, even while dealing with terrifying turbulence or verbally abusive passengers. Healthcare workers must project infinite empathy and stoic authority despite bone-crushing exhaustion and trauma.
Right.
Corporate executives are required to project unwavering confidence even when a company is failing. They are contractually obligated to embody an alter ego.
And if we weave in Randall Collins's work on interaction ritual chains, it becomes clear that maintaining these performative facades is the core currency of social interaction. If you don't play the part, you break the ritual and you are ejected from the tribe.
It is how we establish group membership and safety in a complex society.
Think about how this translates to our digital lives today. Your LinkedIn profile or your real name Facebook account, that is the ultimate hyper-curated front stage. It exists entirely to project stability, competence, educational pedigree, and class alignment. It is a structural performance for employers and peers. But then look at an anonymous Reddit account or a private Discord server where you exist under a pseudonym. That is your digital backstage. That is where you can be unpolished, express unfiltered rage about a movie, or ask embarrassing questions about a medical issue without risking your professional reputation.
It's a perfect modern parallel. The dramaturgical mask, whether it's a forced smile in a retail store or a sanitized LinkedIn bio, is not an act of malicious deception. It is an essential, highly adaptive interface. It enables individuals to secure economic resources and navigate complex, often hostile institutions, all while protecting the vulnerable, messy, core backstage self from exposure and burnout.
So we've seen how individuals use these masks for corporate and economic survival. But what happens when an entire demographic faces systemic hostility? When the danger isn't just getting fired, but losing your physical life? This brings us to the final major domain of the research, the alter ego as a collective cultural shield.
When systemic oppression, institutional violence, or existential crises threaten specific social groups, the creation of protective alter egos scales up. It evolves from an individual's psychological coping mechanism into a massive collective cultural strategy for physical and psychological survival.
The paper provides incredibly powerful historical example of this, focusing on gender, subculture, and the Harlem ballroom system in the 1960s. And it is vital to note that we are examining this through a strictly historical and sociological lens to impartially understand the mechanisms of how marginalized human communities react to severe external pressure.
The environmental pressure in this context was lethal. We're talking about Black and Latinx transgender women and queer youth in the 1960s facing systemic poverty, rampant racism, extreme homophobic, and transphobic violence.
It was incredibly dangerous.
There was anti-drag legislation where you could be arrested merely for wearing articles of clothing belonging to the opposite sex, and they faced total abandonment by their biological families. The dominant society was entirely hostile to their existence.
So how did they adapt? They built their own structural ecosystem. Pioneers like Crystal LaBeija, who faced intense racism even within the underground white drag pageant circuits of the time, decided to bypass the hostile systems entirely.
Right.
She founded the House of LaBeija, establishing the drag house system. These houses function as fiercely protective chosen families and safe havens for youth who had nowhere else to go.
Within this ballroom culture, participants constructed distinct, highly glamorous stage personas. They built elaborate, powerful alter egos. And they competed in walking categories with names like executive realness or schoolboy realness.
The concept of realness is the sociological key here. It wasn't just a beauty pageant. What was the explicit function of performing realness?
The construct of realness was defined as the capacity to flawlessly pass as heteronormative, cisgender, or affluent in the dominant hostile outside world. And adopting these specific alter personas to serve two distinct, deeply self-preservative functions.
What was the first one?
First, physical survival. Mastering realness in the safety of the ballroom enabled marginalized individuals to navigate hostile public spaces, get on a subway, or walk down the street without drawing attention. The alter ego was literal physical camouflage. It reduced the risk of police arrest, harassment, or physical violence.
And the second function was psychological and relational survival.
Yes. Constructing these celebrated ballroom identities allowed youth who had been entirely rejected, dehumanized, and deemed worthless by their biological families to reclaim self-worth. They built a system where they could experience agency, artistic expression, and immense social prestige within a supportive, chosen family structure.
So the alter ego wasn't just a shield to deflect violence. It was a mechanism to absorb love and respect.
It is a profound historical example of identity modulation literally saving lives. And we see this performative shielding aspect of alter egos manifested incredibly clearly in the performing arts as well.
Oh, definitely.
The paper lists some absolutely iconic examples of famous artists using alter egos to manage extreme public scrutiny, process trauma, and contain aspects of themselves they couldn't otherwise express without destroying their core identity.
The performing arts are like a laboratory for identity modulation. David Bowie is a classic example. He created Ziggy Stardust, this omnisexual alien rock star.
Yeah, exactly.
Bowie utilized Ziggy to navigate his own profound personal isolation, to explore highly taboo identity themes of the 1970s, and to radically expand his theatrical capabilities from safely behind a mask. When the sheer weight of the fame and the persona became psychologically destructive, he notoriously killed off Ziggy Stardust to protect his core self.
And then you have Beyoncé. For years, she utilized the stage alter ego Sasha Fierce. Beyoncé has spoken openly about how her core personality is actually quite introverted, private, and rooted in traditional values.
Which is so interesting to think about given her stage presence.
Right, well, Sasha Fierce was developed as a psychological shield to handle the intense, aggressive, and often hypersexualized expectations of global music performance. Sasha could perform with a ferocity on stage that Beyoncé Knowles, the core person, would be too terrified or embarrassed to execute.
It is the exact same mechanism as the Batman effect, just applied to stadium pop. The paper also highlights Marshall Mathers, Eminem, and his alter ego Slim Shady.
Another fascinating mechanism of containment.
Yeah, Mathers deployed Slim Shady, this hyper-aggressive, deeply provocative sociopathic persona, to channel his severe poverty-induced trauma, rage, and despair into cathartic artistic output. But crucially, the alter ego kept that toxicity contained within the music, preserving his primary identity and values as a father offstage.
It acts as a vocal container for the darkness. Similarly, Nicki Minaj developed Roman Zelensky, a chaotic, angry, completely uninhibited persona. Roman served as a container to express intense theatricality and rage that her primary polished artistic identity simply could not accommodate at the time.
The alter ego expands the emotional bandwidth of the artist without breaking the core person.
And if we step back even further, beyond modern pop culture and sociology, we see that this mechanism is woven into the very fabric of human history and religion. Adopting alternate personas is a globally recognized, historically embedded strategy for emotional regulation and communal survival.
Let's look at ritual masks in ancient cultures, because they weren't just decorative.
Across countless ancient and indigenous societies, ritual mask wearing allowed individuals to temporarily submerge their private, vulnerable, everyday identity beneath a sacred, culturally recognized archetype. When a person put on the mask, they were no longer themselves. They structurally became the spirit or the deity.
Which granted them immense spiritual authority.
Exactly, and allowed for massive emotional release during times of communal crisis. In many traditions, it even provided strict legal immunity for actions taken while in trance.
And we still see this underlying cognitive mechanism in modern religious devotions, just in a less theatrical form. The paper points out the Christian practice of asking, "What would Jesus do?" or WWJD.
Yes, from a cognitive psychology perspective, that is a culturally embedded, highly effective form of self-distancing, just like the Batman effect. By consciously stepping away from a panicked, egocentric perspective and striving to embody the imagined perspective of a supreme religious exemplar, individuals significantly reduce their personal anxiety.
That makes total sense.
They improve their moral perseverance, regulate their limbic system, and make decisions aligned with their long-term values rather than immediate fear.
The paper also touches on something recognized by the World Health Organization in the ICD-11, possession trance disorders.
This is a critical sociological intersection. In many cultures worldwide, possession trance states, where a person's primary identity is temporarily replaced by a spirit, ancestor, or deity, are fully recognized and integrated into society. Cross-culturally, anthropologists note that these states frequently emerge within deeply marginalized populations.
Particularly among women living in highly patriarchal, oppressive societies.
Right. Yes. Because it provides a voice that they're otherwise completely denied. It offers a socially sanctioned, highly protective channel to express suppressed emotions, demand community resources, or process severe trauma. Because it is the spirit demanding support or expressing terrifying anger, the individual is shielded from social or physical punishment.
The alter ego acts as a spiritually sanctioned safety valve. It is incredible how consistent the underlying function is across every single domain we've looked at today. Whether it is a deep neurobiological shift in the cortical limbic circuitry, a cognitive trick to pass a math test, a corporate mask worn by a flight attendant, or a cultural ritual in a ballroom or a temple.
The primary function remains identical: protection, modulation, and survival of the organism.
Which brings us to the formal synthesis of this massive deep dive into the source material. After looking at the neurobiology of trauma, the evolutionary ladder of the nervous system, cognitive self-distancing, microsociology, and cultural history, I have to ask for the final verdict on Victor H. Sertuche's hypothesis. Is the idea that every human natively develops an alter ego for self-preservation a biological fact or a cultural myth?
Well, it entirely depends on how you define the terms. If you define alter ego literally as a discrete structural psychiatric entity, like a fully separate personality with different memories living in a partitioned section of your brain, then no. In its absolute literal formulation, the hypothesis is false. Structural fragmentation, like we see in DID, is a rare, specific pathoneurobiological adaptation to severe trauma. It is not a universal developmental outcome.
Right, we don't all have a literal Mr. Hyde sleeping in our hippocampus.
But if we evaluate the hypothesis functionally, if we view the alter ego as an evolved, adaptive identity modulation mechanism, as a fluid, protective persona that your brain deploys to preserve your executive function and physical safety, then decisively, yes. The underlying claim of Sertuche's paper is absolutely proven. The machinery of the alter ego is universal.
So, what does this all mean for us? It means that human identity is not that solid, static, predictable house we talked about at the beginning of the show. It is a highly plastic, incredibly dynamic system. Whether it is your deep brain rerouting the horror of inescapable trauma, or a 5-year-old kid pretending to be Batman so they don't cry out of frustration over a puzzle, or a retail worker pasting on a cheerful, unbothered smile while their soul is being crushed by a customer.
Or an artist creating a Sasha Fierce to survive the terrifying energy of a stadium.
Exactly. Every single one of these instances is the exact same underlying biological and psychological machinery at work. Your identity is engineered, above all else, to protect you.
It is a brilliantly adaptive, ancient system. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an incredibly provocative question about where human identity is heading in the very near future. We spent a lot of time discussing how we create these front stage personas, these digital alter egos on LinkedIn or Reddit to protect our backstage selves.
Right, the mask protects the real us, the physical us.
But as artificial intelligence and virtual reality advance at an exponential rate, we are increasingly spending our time seamlessly insetting highly complex digital avatars in the metaverse. Avatars that can look, sound, and react exactly how we want them to, completely free from the physical limitations, vulnerabilities, and prejudices attached to our biological bodies.
Oh, wow. I see where you're going with this.
Will there come a point in human evolution where our future digital alter egos actually become more neurologically integrated, more expressive, and feel more real to our default mode network than our physical backstage selves? Will the digital mask eventually become the primary identity? Because the physical world simply feels too limited, too exhausting, and too dangerous to endure.
That is a staggering thought. Are we actively building the ultimate permanent alter egos right now in the cloud, like completely outsourcing our identity modulation to a server that completely flips the script on what it means to have a core self? That is something I'm going to be thinking about for a very, very long time. You've given us so much to mull over today. Thank you to Victor H. Sertuche and Gemini for this incredible research synthesis, and thank you, the listener, for taking this journey with us on Today and the Hypothesis.
It has been an absolute privilege to unpack this complex neurobiology with you.
Before you go, please make sure to hit that subscribe button wherever you are listening to this deep dive into the source material. And take a second to share this with a friend. We all know someone who is carrying a heavy load right now who could use this information, or who might just need permission to deploy their own Batman effect to get through their day-to-day without feeling guilty about it. So until next time, remember that the house of your identity has a lot more rooms than you think, and every single one of them was built to keep you safe. See you next time.